Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Vamsi Kodir. I'm the Director of Product Management here at Normalize. I have Joe Gregory, Head of Customer Success, here with me as well. Before we begin the session, there's a couple housekeeping items I want to address. The session is being recorded and it'll be available 30 minutes after it ends. You can watch it again later or feel free to send it out to your colleagues. We want the session to be interactive, so please ask questions as they arise. We'll have a dedicated Q&A section at the end. And finally, we'll check out the attachment section. We'll have a few helpful resources relevant to today's session, and there'll also be some ways for you to contact us for any follow-up questions after that. So, all right, let's get started. So jumping right into it, one of the big problems that we're seeing today, and most of you are familiar with, is data is exploding, right? And more so than just the increase in data volume or velocity in which it's growing, I think one of the biggest challenges that we're seeing in today's environment is where this data is residing, right? We've seen a lot of data transition away from secure environments like enterprise data centers or on-premise data stores to more and more data now being in the public cloud or SaaS or PaaS. And obviously, some of this is being driven by a lot of the modern technologies that we started to implement and digital transformation that's occurred, especially accelerated since COVID. But this is kind of changing how businesses really have to think about securing their data. And with all these new platforms and tools, it's also changing the ways people can access and leverage and even share some of this information, right? So essentially it's like a modern challenge now that businesses have to account for, and it's kind of come on very, very rapidly. And this is a huge problem. And I think it's kind of where we have to really look at solutions like DSPM or more modern security protocols and programs to really address some of these emerging risks.
Yeah, thanks, Vamsi. I think personally, I've been in security for a while. I've worked with a lot of different teams focused on different things, being potentially vulnerabilities, infrastructure configurations. And at the end of the day, it just proves to be an endless cycle of remediation without the right context. And organizations are tired of this vulnerability fatigue, alert noise. And they're investing heavily in defining a risk score that aligns their organization about what to fix first, bringing in their teams around that risk score and trying to focus on what they think is most important. But those scores still don't take data and put that at the forefront. So at the end of the day, it's still an uneducated guess. And you're not sure if you're moving the needle on is your data really protected or is it vulnerable?
Yeah, definitely, right. And I think that's one of the things that kind of, if we start thinking about some of the challenges that are really coming from this, and ultimately data is very, very vulnerable, as you mentioned, and this is being driven by several different factors, right? One of the things I want to call out is AI and ML has been exploding recently. We all know about this, all the new Gen AI, all these things that are now evolving, becoming kind of the forefront of what businesses want to start leveraging. These are exposing businesses to additional risks, right? There's a pretty high profile incident last year where large business had a few employees upload some sensitive information to their ChatGPT. And this was patents, things that weren't public knowledge yet, source code, things of that nature. And this was now available to competition, to the public. Part of this is simply just due to people not being fully educated of the risks of some of these new applications and services that are being available, right? So how do you ensure that you can, one, as a business, continue to use and leverage modern technologies, but also educate your team or get visibility into potential vulnerabilities or gaps that these might have in your business, right? I think that's a pretty important thing to highlight here because AI is not stopping. This is kind of the new frontier. You need tools that are going to address a lot of these gaps that are essentially going to be, coming out as both from visibility, but also education. Another key part that's making data vulnerable now is also the explosion in the number of total services, right? There's lots of things that are connecting to our data today, copying it, replicating it, providing access, things that are even automated, right? Sometimes not even humans that are getting access to this information. So how do you get a good picture of what they're doing with your data? How are they configured, right? These are all things that are increasing the overall surface area of risks and other challenges that are coming out of it. Another thing I want to highlight also is your data is now sitting in a variety of different places. Some could be in SaaS, some could be in the cloud, some could be on-prem. All of these have different security protocols and controls that you have to ensure are enforced to protect your data, right? And this is essentially adding to complexity for your security teams and ensuring that they're all, on par with each other in terms of how you secure them, right? So this is just requires more time, more effort, more manual solutions, and none of the traditional approaches that business might have implemented really do all of this comprehensively, right? Leading to potentially different attack paths and ways for people to kind of get into data. And this ties into more of the obvious reasons about misconfigurations or IAM policies or how roles and privileged access is being granted. All these things are exploding and becoming very cumbersome and hard to manage, right? But ultimately, all these boil down to compliance. Are we meeting regulatory requirements? All these things are changing day to day. Trying to manage all of this on your own as a business without leveraging new solutions that are going to give you some of this key insights and context is ultimately what's leading to more of this vulnerabilities in data and the gap in which it's taking for business to address and plug some of these holes.
Yeah, and I think in a world where security talent can be hard to come by, teams tend to be playing catch up. No matter how much you invest, security teams may not be in a position to enable these systems to be safe. And ML, microservices, SaaS applications, your business needs these to be competitive. And the time is now really to get a handle on this. Understand where data is moving around in your environment, what risk it poses to the organization, and aligning your organization around data. And if you don't do that, I don't think you're really going to have a chance to keep up, and ultimately your data will be exfiltrated. SaaS in particular, in file sharing applications, convenience is the selling point of these applications, not security. And having to understand the admin console of every tool, where's data moving, how do I implement access governance? It's become an overwhelming task.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you mentioned that, right? And this kind of really comes down to one question I always ask is, are businesses even aware, or how confident are they that their data is secure, right? And one of the things that we're seeing is that most businesses, more than 50% of them don't believe that their data in the cloud, like PaaS or IaaS, is even secure. And obviously, then this metric is showing that they think their SaaS is more secure. But one of the things that this doesn't highlight is, look, I mean, you put these together, it's more than 70% potentially of business data they're not even comfortable, right? In terms of the security programs or ensuring that no one can get access to it. But more importantly, this is really addressing the known knowns. Just imagine how much of data that they don't even know exists could be insecure or has ways for people to kind of get access to, right? None of the existing solutions today, pre DSPM, really give them good visibility into this where they can address the unknown unknowns, right? And this is kind of where the challenges are emerging is, how do you build confidence, right? We want a tool that's going to let you understand your entire environment, where your most valuable assets are, and what your vulnerabilities and gaps are, right? So that you don't have to feel insecure. You know what steps you can take, and you know exactly where to focus your efforts. I think that's going to be super important when it comes to securing your cloud environments and beyond, kind of for the future, especially with all the evolution of applications and products that are going to be coming over the next decade and beyond, right? So that's definitely something that people have to keep in mind.
Yeah, and quite often when we onboard customers to our DSPM platform, they come in with a list of data sources they're aware of. We integrate and onboard those, and we discover there are other SaaS apps running in their cloud environment. Perhaps there's been an integration set up with an S3 bucket, and they've really got to chase that down, understand where data is flowing out of their environment, and put the controls in place, and really align everyone around controls around these SaaS applications. And it's not just the data that's needed to those SaaS applications. Employees are using those to copy, share, and keep notes. And you've really got to have a handle on what that is, because that data could be just as impactful to your environment. And another big takeaway quite often is they have this inventory and they realize how much of this data is just sitting there. Is it needed? Quite often it's duplicate or it's stale. And being able to clean up your environment and get rid of this unnecessary data really makes it a lot easier for security teams to manage the remaining attack surface. Cleaning up abandoned backups, dormant access, it has a very large impact and allows your team to hone in on the real threats, rather than being overwhelmed with data that you don't need to be protecting.
Yeah, and I think it's one interesting thing too about SaaS is probably worth mentioning, right? Is it makes it seem your business seem more confident about their SaaS applications. But in my mind, I start thinking about potential gaps and vulnerabilities, and it's SaaS is kind of the wild, wild west, right? You might not always have full control over what someone's doing. They could be storing specific credentials or excerpts from information in, let's say, the OneDrive or the Google, or in the example I gave earlier, uploading things to different applications, which expose you to risk instantly, right? It's very hard to monitor sometimes even what people are leveraging these applications for. So really kind of ensure that business understands some of the risks with different applications, but also have some sort of proactive management around it where you can identify potential challenges, or we mentioned a little bit about similarity earlier and being able to identify duplicates. These are all things that are very, very valuable, right, when it comes to how data is flowing through different environments. So you kind of ensure holistic security instead of trying to do this piecemeal approach where you're securing one environment but not the other, and your data is equally exposed, right? So making sure that both of these kind of are on par and giving customers that confidence, I think, is going to be super important moving forward, especially when they consider what tools to buy to really address some of these challenges moving forward.
Yeah, and I think that confidence is really key, because often there's, in order to clean up data, you've got to understand how it's getting there, who's putting it there, what's the activity level, and how often are employees actually leveraging the access they've been granted. Can this be restricted? And how can I reduce my surface attack? That's really the primary focus in SaaS. And then as you get a handle on that, you can implement policies and controls and monitor those in real time with DSPM and ensure that things are being adhered to. And you can react quickly when there may be exceptions. So in the world of SaaS, I think even more importantly, there's questions that are difficult to answer. And if you don't have answers to these questions, I think you're going to struggle with protecting user data, business information, proprietary data. Where is my data? Is it sensitive? And who has access to it? That's something that you'll get immediately when you onboard a DSPM solution. And as far as what risks there are to that data, we're really focusing on an attack path to the data, not just all of the misconfigurations in the environment and employing your team to go and fix them all. We're honing in on what puts data at risk and what's the cost of potential exposure. And that's ultimately how organizations are using DSPM to align their remediation efforts and make sure they're fixing the right things that are going to help them reduce the exposure of a potential impact, a potential breach, as well as preparing for compliance audits and putting themselves in a good position to enable the business to operate effectively. And these questions can be difficult. And that's why data breaches are almost an inevitable fact in business today. We have organizations that have focused on reducing the impact of a potential breach by deploying normalize, a DSPM solution, getting an inventory, understanding what data they need to protect, so that if and when a breach does happen, they can be confident that the impact will be restricted and they can really get a good handle on what was impacted. As breaches have become almost a daily occurrence, sometimes folks are becoming numb to these disclosures, and regulations are coming into play to really address this. Not only do you have to understand where your data is and who accesses it, but in the event of a breach, you now need to disclose this to the public very quickly, sometimes within a matter of days. And if you don't know what data you had, you don't know what was breached, this is going to be a very large challenge, perhaps an impossible task. And DSPM can also really help you assess whether a breach may have been material, what data was accessed, how much of that was duplicate data, and doesn't necessarily extend the impact of the breach, and what ultimately was the material impact. I think we can really help there as well. And at the end of the day, if you don't align your organization around data security, you will be breached, and it's just become a modern fear and reality.
Yeah, I think that's a good point too, right? Is I think there's a few things that kind of even go unnoticed in this whole thing is like the trickle down effect of these breaches. Like, sometimes I'll kind of think about it. It's like if my social security number becomes available to the public or it's on the dark web, once it's out there, it's out there. There's no going back. I can't walk into an office and get my social security number changed, right? So there's generally becoming more of that increasing sense from, as a consumer even, that how do I trust the business with my data? If I'm providing this key information that has long-term impact on myself, can I trust them with it, right? So there's the whole issue comes down to when breaches are inevitable, how as a business are we protecting our own customers from potential attacks, right? And kind of having that harm carry over long term for them. Are we able to minimize the surface area? These are all key questions that I think business needs to be thinking about, and we help our customers really answer some of these as plugging all these gaps early enough in the process, being more proactive to essentially minimize this impact, right? Because when something ultimately feels inevitable, your best foot forward is really figuring out they're going to get in. Let me make sure they get nothing of importance, right? Or reduce the scope in which they can. Or in some cases, can I detect it early enough where I can lock them out, right? These are all different things that we should really be considering when we talk about modern approaches to a lot of these challenges, right? It's really changed the security landscape in the sense if you look at some of these companies that we have here, these are all massive businesses, right? And some of them had multiple breaches. And this is just the current state of affairs. So I think that's super important to really think about as when you think about security programs moving forward. How do we mitigate risk for ourselves, but also ensure that our customers feel confident in us in protecting them for using our platform or things like that. So yeah, I think for me that's super important, and I think Joe, you've probably heard it as well from our customers, right? That's it's a huge pillar for them moving forward.
Yeah, and like I mentioned earlier, I think teams have invested in a variety of tools. They're different organizations within the company may have different motivations, different tools they're using, and they're operating in silos and doing their best to integrate these tools to give them this single view that I think DSPM can give you, with one deployment.
Yeah, and then talking about silos, right? We think about how businesses are leveraging today. It's like not it, depending on where their data sits and also what type of coverage you're looking to get, they're having to use a combination of these different tools. And even then, it's not really covering them fully, right? In some cases, they're still having to do manual effort. Then you have the whole challenge around it in terms of are all these tools going to be on the same update cadence? Are they all going to be giving me the same level of coverage and security? Am I going to have visibility into my data? And ultimately, the answer has been that even when all of these play together, there's clear gaps that they provide, right? None of these were built to be data centric solutions. They're all going to be able to handle specific functions or tasks in the day to day programs, but it still requires you to do a lot of manual work or effort as a team to ensure that you're protecting your most valuable assets, right? They're very good at the known knowns. If you're able to define a policy or a rule or figure out specific scenarios that you want to have addressed, you could potentially use a solid approach to get you most of the way there. But again, the challenge today is with how quickly data is evolving and all these different things that are operating in your environment. The unknowns are more scary to me, right? How do we find something that really plugs, makes me feel secure? And this is where normalize comes in. Is we're helping our customers get that visibility, right? We've deployed for many customers today, and we're like, oh snap, we didn't even know that data existed. And some of these cases have been super valuable data. And I think you can speak to that a little bit, Joe, right? Is they're shocked in some cases even that they didn't know that this existed.
Yes, and all these tools, they all expect you to either tell them where your sensitive data is, or they make assumptions about where your crown jewels reside. And sensitive data doesn't just exist in your production environments. We've onboarded customers that are deploying in a pre-production environment, just testing the deployment, and we classify and find highly sensitive data in these environments. They could be employee records. I've seen production data brought in for scale testing, and there really just was no thought put behind it, and that data is not even being used anymore. So our customers have been able to, one, clean up some of this data that doesn't belong where it is, and also reach out throughout the organization and put the right controls around that. And the existing security tools are just focused on the wrong thing. They are not honing in on your data, and they don't have a good signal as to when data is changing. So if you don't know where your data is, there's no way you'll be able to protect it with any of these tools.
Yeah, I think that's like the main point, right? Is we don't ever want to have a false sense of security. And I think with how things are changing in the landscape today, is visibility is king, right? We talked about being able to answer these key questions earlier. DSPM solutions are kind of tailored to address those questions around your data, right? Their whole, the whole focus is being data centric and working its way up to then security and how it's being accessed. I think that's a whole new lens that we're taking here with this approach because that's the way attackers are looking at it. Data is worth more than gold these days, right? In some cases, you can argue it's worth more than oil. And the amount of information that you're going to get from a business through breaches is immense. So DSPM is really helping address it from that angle, as well as being able to address customers being more proactive, I think. And industry analysts agree with this, right? So this is a Gartner quote, but essentially they're doubling down on the notion DSPM solutions are the ones that are going to help you discover your unknown data and identify some of these key gaps in security and privacy as when data is moving through your different pipelines or even across boundaries. I think this is a key comment, right? Is one of the things today that the solid solutions don't do is give you that full picture of the flow of data within your own environment. Is someone moving something from my AWS back to my OneDrive, copying it, making modifications, then sharing it externally? How do I identify the full picture and context of how my own users are leveraging my data? How is this being exposed, right? Without that full view, it's very hard to take appropriate practice either from an education perspective or even enforcing the right security controls. And, from my perspective, I think a lot of times education is super important, right? Your security programs are only as strong as your lowest common denominator. If people don't understand the risks of their actions or what good practices are for how to manage or share sensitive information, you're always going to be at risk. And DSM solutions are going to give you insights into where you might need to focus on some of these additional efforts that might not even be directly protocols or security controls, right? It's training your team internally, and I think Joe, we've seen that at a few places as being one of the main drivers, right? Is how can we leverage the normalized platform to also educate our team on things that they might be doing incorrectly.
Yes, and bringing different functions within an organization together to answer these questions. You have data privacy teams, you have legal and compliance, you have your typical infosec risk management teams, and they're often motivated by different tools, signals, and ultimately everyone should be focused on protecting data, understanding who's accessing that data, and then build their programs as a framework around that. And bringing teams together, helping them collaborate, and focusing on data, I think, is the way to really turn down the noise and the alert fatigue we discussed, and finally start moving the needle on where data security and what your posture is, and reducing the impact of breach.
Yeah, exactly, right, and that's kind of our whole vision around being a single platform for data security and protection. So our goal has always been to, can we provide insights for everything from discovery, classification, access management, compliance, or vulnerability across your data no matter where it sits, right? Being that single pane of glass, I think, is a notion that we find that's super important because, look, ultimately, if we can give our customers insights holistically into where all their key information is or their key data resides, and they can funnel this to where they see in their pipeline, they're going to gain confidence of having to log into multiple different tools or solutions to kind of get those key answers, right? And how we do it is, I think, pretty straightforward. We want to connect to our customers' data where it resides without moving or copying any of it into our own environment, right? We believe that, this is the right way to go about it so that we're not exposing customer any additional risks or privacy concerns. And in the customers' environments themselves, we're able to discover all their data, even ones they're unaware of, and classify it so we can understand better how much of it is sensitive, what's it worth, where is all of this residing, right? And be able to delineate that for our customers to really focus their priorities on. We're also able to understand kind of the lineage and similarity and duplicate data that resides there as well, right? It's just a huge thing that, we see come up all the time. We have a bunch of copy data that's sitting there that I haven't been using or it's no longer needed. All these things are adding up to overall costs and surface area for attacks. And these are all things that we can surface automatically. Pretty much you're getting value the moment we deploy. This is all information that we can automatically surface to our customers, right? So we've seen that huge impact where customers are like, man, we didn't think we'd get all this right away. And this is the value of a DSPM solution like Normalize is we have this full context, not just in one environment, but across the entire landscape of our customers. And they can also configure and tune these to fit their needs, right? Maybe they might have some custom entities or custom classifications. We're able to leverage and surface all these details as well. And this is super valuable, right? And on top of that, we're also able to understand who and what is accessing this. Is it a user? Are they getting access through a role? Is it through a different application? All these details are going to be tied into the context of the data so they can take the appropriate actions and better understand, potentially how customers, how this data is going to be exposed, right? But one of the things I want to highlight a little bit more, Joe, is, anomaly detection and abuses, right? I think we've heard this from a lot of customers today is this is going to be a huge driver moving forward. How do we be more proactive and understanding if a user's behavior in my system has changed? This has changed based on how they might have performed in the past, could be changed from how their peers are acting, right? Kind of building more of those similarity groups in terms of expected behavior, but also maybe they're taking actions that are not on par with our organization. Some use cases that we've heard around this is, if my CEO or my C-suite's accessing valuable IP or patent information, it's probably more secure than if a contractor or a third party or even a new hire is all of a sudden logging in, copying all my sensitive documents onto their own drive and then sharing it. These are all key indicators that could indicate account takeover, data exfiltration. And you want to catch those early, right? Because any of these actions by themselves probably seems innocuous. Being able to discern what potentially these risks, what risk could be indicated from these activities is going to be super important, minimizing surface area like we talked about from breaches, right?
Yeah, there's a lot of indicators ultimately before data is exfiltrated. Some of the things that we hear customers really appreciate is understanding when data is being compressed and encrypted in your environment. are the users doing this, typically taking these operations? And if you don't have an idea of what your users and resources are doing on a day-to-day basis, you're not going to be able to really identify when they've strayed from that. And when an identity is compromised, is that data exfiltration moving very slowly? Is there a large data movement activity that we can alert on? And I think this is really the next generation of data security. Now that you have an inventory, you have an idea of what's there and what's classified, what's changing, because this is happening every minute of the day. And you've got to have a good eye on this and not be in a situation where you're being alerted so often that you really can't get to the things that matter.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, ultimately, when you even found all these risks or gaps or threats, you need to be able to tell what to do, right? How do we fix it? This is another thing that the platform provides is guided remediation. Is when we identify a vulnerability or a gap, we're not just going to tell you that a gap exists and you go figure it out. We're telling you all the potential steps you can take to secure this environment or this resource or even remove access, right? This ensures that our customers always know what options that they can take based on how their environments are configured or set up, and we surface this in their pipelines itself. And this has been very well received. In some cases, we even offer one-click remediation. And this all kind of ties into the notion of how do we reduce the friction, right? How do we make it easier for security teams to manage their process, but also reduce any, ambiguity in terms of what steps they need to take, right? So that ensures that no matter how skilled or how untrained someone is, they're always going to know what steps to take, and we provide that out of box, ensuring that you're always going to be able to secure your environments. I think, which is ultimately the end goal, right? Is how do we protect our data and our customers' data and give them the confidence to do so.
And you have to be able to make decisions, with the right context, and that's ultimately where you need to understand all of your data, the risk around that, and ultimately tie everything we've talked about into a single view. And having a single view allows you to make collaborative decisions across the organization, and really is the only way to ever find peace of mind. If you don't have a good view into everything that's out there, you're always leaving a gap, and that may always be true. But you have to be hooked into data, and you have to understand how it's coming into your environment. And then once you've got a good inventory and catalog, where do you begin? What do you fix first? What do I prioritize? What's the activity level of data? And ultimately, what's the potential impact to my organization? So we focus on answering questions for any persona that's coming into the platform, whether that's an executive, a security analyst, a data privacy engineer, and being able to get to actionable data within a few clicks, whether you're working on compliance or you really want to drill into new data that has flowed into your environment. What are the deltas? Providing users with heat maps and trend lines, and really alerting them to what is going to have an impact. I think that's what's really going to drive data risk down and ultimately reduce the impact of that potential breach.
Yeah, and I think, one of the things that I've seen, Joe, then this resonates with me when I look at this dashboard. It's also something that we've heard from our customers, right? Is a lot of times the data is so siloed within the organization itself that you don't always have cross-team visibility, even cross-org visibility. So a lot of times when it comes to securing these environments, different teams are responsible for different resources. So this unified dashboard really gives security teams the confidence to kind of drill down into things that are most important to them, right? They can identify, is there like some commonality? Is there a reason that these types of data stores, a specific team that manages it, right? But they're able to really drill down based on the types of data that's most important, maybe by region, maybe types of data stores, and really gives them that flexibility to understand that no matter what their focus point is, we have a path to really get them down into the most granular details, right? But they can always start holistically and understand, how's my distribution look like? Is there something I'm not missing? And this is super valuable when it comes to the security solution, because this is what we build confidence with, right? This is how they can interact and understand their environments better, which is one of the biggest gaps today is, if all of a sudden you have a bunch of data that's in an S3 bucket that wasn't there the day before, this dashboard is going to surface it for you because it's looking at distribution as well, but also the risk and monetary value assessments are all coming in one place. And it's very easy to identify these deltas and trends, as you mentioned. And I think that's a huge value driver in terms of getting that quick information, right? Because, if you have thousands of databases or data stores, how do you identify if something new or something risky has happened, right? And this kind of lets you filter through some of that noise and identify changes.
And it's moving so quickly and being brought into your environment almost at a real-time basis. You have to have a scalable solution that can give you those real-time signals. If you're assessing data with a legacy tool and you're scanning monthly or even weekly, that's a long time in today's age around data. And when you
Yeah.
find data that's at risk, what do you address first? You've got to have a way to like I've said, align your organization around the data risk. Many organizations understanding the monetary value of the data based on public breaches, based on fines, you can ultimately define the quantity or the value of a single sensitive record and extrapolate that across your environment to help you prioritize and understand what data types, what data stores hold the most of my crown jewels. I need to lock those down first. And that's really how you can move the needle, like I said, because the value of data that's at a risk of potential breach, you can make an impact on that very quickly. Then focus on fixing problems at the source and aligning your organization around policies that prevent this. And this has resonated with all of our customers because they're typically focused on one data platform where they know there's something sensitive. And when they have their eyes opened to just how much data has moved around their environment, they really take a step back and rethink, okay, so what's the approach here? And focusing on that risk is ultimately how you can come up with actionable remediation and get through the alert noise and understand how are attackers really going to get to my data rather than just focusing on what is the highest score CVE or what are exploit signals on a particular vulnerability. What is the true attack path to my data?
Yeah, I think, one of the other things that I want to call out, and this is, coming from a product person, but I think being able to provide our customers the ability to configure and customize these to their needs, their business unit, or maybe how their data is distributed, or even their priorities, right? I think is a super valuable thing that we offer through the platform. Whether, maybe monetary value is a key indicator for them. Maybe it's types of data classifications. Maybe it's provider types. We brought in a lot of customization options here so that user, when they're maybe creating automations to funnel these things into their pipeline, they can choose what their most important drivers are, right? And provide all this context, Joe, that you mentioned is all going to come automatically. But we found that being able to ensure that customers don't have to retrain their entire team on how to leverage our tool or how to manage tickets or alerts that we're generating is going to be one of the most important things to adoption, right? Minimizing friction, I think, has been one of our pillars from day zero. Is we have all these different ways for you to prioritize. Choose what you see fit, but we're going to give you as much context and detail as possible. And I think that's landed well with customers. And I think it's also something potential businesses have to think about is does this tool give me the controls to fit my needs? And I think we, at least from my perspective, we give them all these options to choose how to do that. Which
You do need flexibility for sure, Vamsi. And I think depending on what compliance regulations you have to adhere to, that often defines what you're going to go out and address first and who you need to educate across the organization to prevent that going forward. And like we've mentioned previously with siloed tools, there is a real effort in integrating and coming up with a single remediation plan based on all of these siloed tools. And that in itself is a major effort and often leads to a waste in resources and not moving the needle like you thought. So, one of the things at DSPM and I'm very proud of our platform is the ability to draw out data attack paths, visualize those, help your organization connect the dots between what potentially each of these siloed tools might be telling you, attaching that data context and drawing a full risk chain. So you can understand this internet user has indirect access to my data because of an IAM, a resource configuration. There's a potential breach here. We need to lock this down. And how widespread is this? I want to alert on this and define it as a policy so that this can't happen in my environment again. I need to understand what are the various ways of addressing this. Does the data need to exist? Is it stale? Is it important to my business? Can I move it to a cold storage? Often there's a cost savings approach here as well. You're trying to reduce risk and you're realizing that I don't need to secure all this data. We don't have to manage all of this. Let's get it out of our environment and make our jobs easier. And at the same time, they're reducing their AWS bill or their storage backup costs. They don't necessarily have to back up as much to these ransomware prevention services because there's no sensitive data in there. There's a large cost savings approach here as well. And rather than looking at each of these individual risks in isolation. You need to look at the full picture to really make a good decision on how you want to address this. How are we going to prevent this from happening again? And that comes in the form of Terraform, like you mentioned earlier. We offer guided remediation. So an organization, a security team can decide the best way to move forward and prevent that in the future by putting these gates in your build pipeline, in your access governance policy, and ultimately access to the data needs to be restricted as much as possible.
Yeah, and I think that's a fantastic point, right, Joe, in the sense that sometimes making sure that you're addressing the root cause of a problem is super important, because if you solve a problem downstream and people still have access, let's say, to credentials somewhere else that's making your data stores downstream exposed, you're not actually solving the problem long term, right? This can expose yourself to risk in the future. I think that's one of the things that our attack path lets customers get confidence in is we're not only showing how everything interacts in their environment, but we're showing all the different ways that potentially someone can get to point C, and as well as how many vulnerabilities we've discovered along the way, right? So when your teams are trying to figure out where do I focus my efforts, if your one of your S3 buckets has most of your valuable data in it, understanding every way that someone can get there and understanding where you're most at risk is super valuable, I think, right? In terms of prioritization and efforts, kind of as we are talking about earlier. And obviously we've seen a lot of impact on this already, and it's something we're going to continue to evolve. But from a business perspective, I think you have to consider, how do I best get information about all the ways that an attacker is going to get in, and can I close all those doors ahead of time? So even if they get through door one, I have enough layers of security after that, right? Minimizing the overall surface of attack and stuff that we've already mentioned earlier. But
yeah, exactly.
yeah, I think super.
It's not just about plugging the holes; it's about putting the right policies and controls in place, and DSPM
Right.
can really guide you to that, and in some cases automate that and give you one-click remediation and infrastructure as code to integrate into your build pipeline. And at the end of the day, data security really is about implementing least privilege. When you have important data to secure, you need to make sure that you're implementing least privilege, and that's something that regulations and best practice define that we need to address this. I think least privilege is something that DSPM can really move the needle on, not just in highlighting how users are getting access to sensitive data, either through assumed roles, nested roles, default permissions when someone joins an organization. There's a lot of ways that users can gain access to sensitive data that once you know it's there, you've got to start addressing these light policies, weak policies. And this is across every platform. Every SaaS application has a different way of managing access control. Often users struggle with understanding the ways of controlling data in a particular platform. And a visual drill down really helps understand what is the change I need to go make in my access to prevent this from happening. And then I can replicate that in my environment, enforce a policy, and use a DSPM solution to give me that auditing function to make sure that there are no exceptions, which plays into both compliance as well as ultimately just reducing your data risk surface.
Yeah, and I think these access graphs are, I think, super valuable, right? We've had a few customers, Joe, we've seen some with over 400,000 users. This is going to be very common for a lot of large enterprises as well, is there's going to be a lot of assumed roles, teams, groups, and privileges that you've established as a business. How do you understand better what these are providing access to, right? Are some even necessary? Am I giving too much access to users that aren't even taking advantage of things that we're providing, right? These all ultimately ties into minimizing surface area of attacks. Now, we've mentioned that a few times today, but I mean, this is kind of, I think the crux of the problem is if you minimize the paths that people can take to get to your valuable assets, it's going to minimize the overall impact of a breach. And if someone wants access to something in the future and you've removed it, they can ask for it. They're at least leveraging the permissions that you've provided, right? But having that full context of, who has access to what, when, and how is one of the additional pieces of information that the access graph that we provide is giving our customers, right? But in some cases, we've also uncovered permissions and roles that they've completely even forgotten about, right? Legacy roles, legacy permissions, things that are just exposing them to unnecessary risks that the business didn't even want to have in place. And this tends to happen more often, I guess, for businesses that have had mergers and acquisitions where they're trying to bring in different users, different groups. It's just this whole landscape changes constantly, right? Based on what you've done over the past year, 2 years. There's just so much tech debt or even knowledge debt that's built up over time that not everyone in the security team even understands how the entire ecosystem of even their own users is. And these are just challenges that we want to be able to help address, right? Long term is building confidence and better visibility into all the different elements of data control and access for sure.
Absolutely. I think, in an example, I worked with a customer on securing their Snowflake deployment, and they had a role-based access control process. They had data masking policies, and they thought they were in a pretty good place until ultimately they had a way to audit those policies and those processes. And they found that, for one, they weren't being refreshed often enough. They needed an automated way to update these rules based on data that was coming into that Snowflake platform. And these big data platforms, they're incredibly powerful, but they give you a lot of flexibility. And unfortunately, there's many ways to expose data and not have a good handle on what's coming into the environment, so that you can constantly be reevaluating. So we've been able to integrate automated access revocation when data is discovered. Folks will lose access, have to request that access. If they're not using it, it automatically gets revoked after 30 days, 90 days. These are ways that you can really take your least privilege access to the next level. And you need that real-time monitoring because things are changing so quickly. And compliance is another area where least privilege, you need to be able to demonstrate it to an auditor. How can I show an auditor that no one in my organization outside of admins can modify critical files? And folks in my HR department aren't able to access documents that should only be seen by my financial team. Least privilege is a key to preventing this internal threat, as well as just accidental exposure. And compliance, ultimately, that's what empowers your business to operate. Bring on new regions, new customers. You have to be maintaining this for their trust, as well as, of course, to remain compliant and get those certifications. What do you need to fix first? What's really putting data at risk? Because quite often, when you don't know what data you have, you're now implementing these policies across your entire organization and spending a lot of time securing data that may not even be in scope, say for PCI or GDPR. That's not sensitive. You can focus your efforts on what really matters and apply policies and business rules on the data that actually needs to be secured. And if you don't know where your data is and you don't know who has access, there's always going to be gaps in your compliance program. And like you say, the breach will be inevitable.
Yeah, look, I mean, one of the biggest things with compliance, right, is the amount of effort that your business has to kind of invest in to ensure that you are remaining compliant. And one of the things that we're really aiming to do with the solution is kind of alleviate some of that burden, right? We're able to check for a plethora of different compliance frameworks and controls and inform you about where you're failing potentially and what steps you might have to take to resolve it, right? This kind of gives our customers peace of mind that if they're making changes in their environment, that we as a solution can catch any violations or potential violations and let them know ahead of time so that they're not exposing themselves to potential, fines or whatnot because they've gone or remained non-compliant over a long period of time, right? Obviously, these are changing so frequently. One of the big things that we need to build, at least our customers want confidence in, is I want to catch these early, and that's kind of one of the main things that our compliance dashboard does is gives you that full distribution for what accounts, what data stores, and what frameworks any of these might be in violation with, as you see kind of here in the screenshot. And I think that's a huge driver in terms of building confidence long term, right? As a solution, and is kind of looking at all these different elements together and surfacing all these key pieces of information.
And just as organizations are starting to realize they have to focus on data, these compliance regulations are doing the same thing. In fact, a solution like DSPM is almost going to be a requirement to even enter these businesses.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess kind of summarize, right, like all the different things that at least our customers get from normalized, but I think more holistically, why this is the modern solution to all these different modern problems we've been talking about today is you essentially want one tool that's going to help you better understand your security posture, but not just understand it, but have the confidence that no matter where my data is sitting, I'm going to have full control or visibility at the minimum in terms of where my risks are, how my valuable data is moving, and how it's being accessed and leveraged, right? Having all of this in one place lets you then decide, do I need to integrate with these other tools to get some additional coverage or protections or policies? But at a starting point, a business should have full control of all their data and where it sits. I think that's one of the main things that we focus with normalize, and then I think DSPM solutions are going to help you kind of achieve that. The next stage is being able to monitor how this data or even your risks are moving through your environment, right? We touched on this a little bit earlier. We're able to tie things together across different environments, whether it's in SaaS, PaaS, IaaS, on-prem, all these different data elements we can leverage to show you how this is being shared, or if there's similar objects and stuff is existing, that you always understand how data is flowing through your business. I think this is a huge driver in terms of being proactive and mitigating additional risks or potential threats, right, from internal or external sources. Monetary value, or even, more importantly, prioritizing your data based off of its worth to you, right? So how do you identify your crown jewels? This is something that we're able to provide to our customers, and it's generally something that business should always be thinking about, right? You need to be able to quickly identify where all your sensitive data is. And if you have key information that you're unaware of, you need to be able to detect it quickly so that you can secure it with the appropriate controls. But most importantly, as we just talked about recently, is proving compliance, right? This is one of the biggest things, and this is more driven by regulations, but remaining compliant also naturally ensures that your data or your business is more secure, and you're going to mitigate overall security risks and threats long term. So it looks like we have a couple questions here before we wrap.
Yeah, I was watching those. Let me ask a couple questions, Vamsi, and we can attack those. One of the questions actually around compliance is how quickly are we implementing new controls? How do we stay up to date on those?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, kind of as I mentioned, we're looking to always be up to date with all the new changes and compliance requirements and frameworks that are updating constantly, right? So we have a dedicated security team that's really focused on making sure that with every release, we're updating our checks and controls for different compliance frameworks. We're also bringing in some of these new frameworks that get implemented, right? And in some cases, we've even launched our checks for these before they've been enforced or gone fully public, because some of our team actually influences some of these programs as well. So it's nice to have that good balance, and that's part of one of the main drivers when we think about security long term is we want to help our customers get ahead of the curve, right? So we're always trying to push to make sure that we're making updates to our checks and giving as much coverage as we can in that regard.
Yeah, I think we love to be thought leaders in the space. I'm very proud of our security research team. Like you mentioned, often they're part of updates to these regulations and have an influence on where data needs to be protected. And I think you're going to see that more and more prevalent in regulations, is having a good handle on data. And these are going to have to adapt to the new challenges from big data, from ML. So I think we're really going to see DSPM, being part of a foundation of a compliant environment.
Yeah,
We had a
definitely.
question, Vamsi, about proprietary data. How can we help a customer secure their internal data, not just PII?
Yeah, so we're talking a little bit earlier about being able to identify similar objects and stuff, right? So our solution is really tailored to be able to identify. So for example, let's say you have proprietary information. Let's say it's a recipe or something that's very unique to your business. We're able to leverage that context around your data to find other things that are similar across your data, across other environments, right? So if you have something unique to your business, systems are already built and designed to really identify and discover these for you. And I talked a little bit earlier about customization and mapping things that are unique to our customers. We have the ability to kind of configure custom entities and custom classifications in the tool as well, so that when we discover these things that are new or unique to a business, the customer can map that to things that make sense to them, or we can map it to specific classification tags or custom classifications, right? Which really let them drive and discover these things kind of automatically using the platform itself, which I think is a huge value add.
And working with customers, depending on the nature of their business, the type of data they process, we offer flexibility in that as well. Being able to modify out of the box data elements and align that with their internal classification policies. And often folks have labeling and business units. They have some intelligence already in their data platforms that we can tap into and help audit those policies about data sharing internally. I also have customers that work with third-party partners and vendors, resellers, and some of this information needs to be needs to be shared with those entities on a time-limited basis. So often contracts, financial documents as well that we need to find in the environment, we need to ensure that they are either deleted or in some cases retained, depending on the use case. So managing that through DSPM is pretty straightforward.
Yeah, awesome. I guess I have a question for, I guess it's good for you, Joe, is what are some of the challenges that we've seen when we're deploying DSPM for some of our customers?
Yeah, I think getting onboarded is surprisingly straightforward. Customers are impressed at how quickly they can see value, but there is a lot of data there. It can be overwhelming when they realize how much they were unaware of. Where do we start? Where's this coming from? I don't know who put it there, so I can't just go delete it. I don't know the purpose of this data. And bringing the teams across the organization together to look at the results, to process them, and understand what is our strategy going to be. I think we play a big role in that as well from a consultative perspective. But at the end of the day, you have to get your business units aligned and make sure that there's no stone unturned. Because if you start to build a policy without knowing what you have, you're always going to be making, or there's a potential of making the wrong choice, right?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's, good point there in terms of just getting that, I think cross-organization buy-in is one of the biggest things, right? Is now we have all these insights. How do we get everyone to start remediating and fixing these things? Because a lot of functions, like we talked about earlier, are spread across different teams. Different regions might own different elements of your environment. And you want to be sure that when you take action, it's going to, you're not going to be crying wolves, proverbially, right? If you will.
Yeah.
But
and reminiscing a bit. Yeah. I think customers, the InfoSec team sometimes has a bad name in the organization for creating a lot of false alerts, just filling up backlogs. And that once you have that initial inventory and you're onboarded and you have access to these dashboards, you bring those teams together, you walk them through it, and they're all pretty excited because they realize that I don't need to deal with these 100 misconfigurations. These two right here, this is the data attack path. Let's go plug these right now. While we're on the call, let's fix this. And we have the remediation steps. So I think pulling teams together across the organization is initially a challenge. And then once they see the outputs and the value that you can get from DSPM, it changes the culture in many ways.
Yeah. Well, awesome. Looks like we're running up against time here. So thanks everyone for joining us for this session. If you want to know more details on how Normalize can kind of help you solve your problems, feel free to reach out to us for a demo. As I mentioned at the start of the session, please take a look at the attachment section. We have a lot of useful information there that you can follow up with us on. And we appreciate your time today.
Thank you, everybody.